So there is entire generations that have effects from lead poisoning, no matter how minor. And from this, there we have a little bit more understanding of lead poisoning now. And if you have small children, they're being screened today about their environments and if they're exposed to lead at all. So we're going to be looking at a next one, and this deals directly with prohibition, and this is denatured alcohol. Now, for a year or two after prohibition went into effect, people were drinking some of the good stuff that they had saved, as we talked about, and bootleggers were selling good stuff. But as prohibition progresses, liquor supply becomes more and more unreliable, as we had talked about, that there's cocktails that are made to mask the flavor. Well, what ends up happening is when one of the biggest threats to this product actually happens from industrial alcohol. Now, for decades prior, the federal government had required that all alcohol had intended for and not intended to be drank was going to be poisoned. This had gone back for decades. So alcohol that was used in cosmetics or medicine or manufacturing was kept out of the liquor supply. With the removal of prohibition, that is no longer regulated. So, and this term is known as denaturing, which means that under normal governmental circumstances, you simply allow the government to regulate the market and make sure that alcohol that is denatured stays out. But this becomes very attractive for bootleggers to use denatured alcohol. Now, bootleggers didn't want to kill their customers by just giving them straight denatured alcohol, but they thought if they could redistill it, that it would get all the poison out, it'd be safe. And you could do this to some degree, but however, you couldn't get out the trace elements of poison. Norris asked Gettler to analyze samples of liquor from various victims that they found, and they were astonished to find how many different poisons were in denatured alcohol. You have methanol, gasoline, benzenes, cadmium, iodine, formaldehyde, and many, many more. And every year, the government would be tinkering and adjusting the formulas for denatured alcohol to prevent people from figuring out how to resynthesize it. And so you didn't know actually what kind of poison you were going to get. So you never knew if you were in a speakeasy or at someone's house or at a grand party what you were actually drinking. People really had no idea what was in their glass. So prohibition had become really a contest between chemists working for the government who's poisoning the denatured alcohol, as well as chemists who were working for bootleggers to try to salvage it. Norris used Gettler's findings as a centerpiece for a national campaign against prohibition. They end up publishing not only in newspapers but in scientific journals throughout the United States, from across the country, exactly what they were finding and exactly what the country was doing to poison this alcohol. The campaign really resonated through the country, and more Americans were seeing that prohibition was a failure. And Norris really cemented this impression, and people began stepping back and saying, maybe this isn't working. Well, the Dries, also known as the pro-prohibitionists, pushed the federal government to basically double down and say, we are literally going to double the amount of poison within the alcohol, and this will stop people from drinking. And so they end up doing this big campaign, and this occurs within December of 1926 and to January 1927. And so what they wanted to do is they were putting out these things. The government is going to poison the alcohol even more. But they put it on not the front pages or anything, so people weren't really noticing. So on Christmas Eve, 1926, hospitals all over New York were flooded with patients that were hallucinating, blinded, comatose, and dying. On New Year's Eve of 1926, the Treasury Department announced that denatured alcohol would be still more poisonous and more deadly. And it was stunning, really, to see um, what you could describe as a mass poisoning by a government policy. And it ends up almost having 900 people in the hospital on New Year's Eve of 1926. 900 people from this poisoning. If prohibition was intended to stop people drinking, the evidence is right there in front of you. It is going drastically wrong. By New Year's, the refrigerators of the Bellevue morgue where Norris worked were lined with corpses, and it took them days to get through and they chronicled the entire epidemic. And in Norris's eyes, prohibition had become a plague. He quotes, "Nearly 10,000 in the city will die this year from strong drink. Our national casualty list for this year from this one cause will outstrip the toll of the Great War. These are the first fruits of prohibition, and this is our price for our national experiment in extermination." End quote. So they are seeing the amount of bodies going up, and it's just in New York alone that they are chronicling it. But they are trying to get the word out that this is happening, that the government is indeed poisoning people. And they know they're poisoning people, and a lot of the pro-prohibitionists said, good, less people are drinking. That's how we want it. We want to put the fear in them. So it's a really double down by the government when they could have, with all the information that they had, and they did have it, to maybe turn back prohibition. They ended up wanting to continue. So the next poison we're going to be looking at is radium. Now, radium was discovered in the late 19th century by Marie Curie and her husband Pierre Curie, and they named it radium because of its radioactivity. It was thought to be the most wonderful thing. Radium was immediately put into medical practices because they noticed that it would shrink tumors. So it was idea that radium had nothing but health-giving properties. Radium was the it thing. You could find it from treating from acne to insanity. Children were fed radium-laced candies and sodas. Women were brought radium-laced facial creams. And radium clinics offered free injections of this wonderful drug that's supposed to pep you up. It was understood that in most medicines, like most medicines, radium could be hazardous, but everyone assumed the danger was very fleeting, that radium would just pass through your body without leaving a trace. And so we're going to look at one story and how Gettler and Norris dealt with this. And the story begins in 1917 in the midst of the war, and we're going to be looking at Amelia Maja, who was at her first job, and she worked at a dial factory in New Jersey. And what they ended up doing as for the war effort is to take faces of watches and paint on the numbers with this with radium that permeated a blue-green light that you could see in the dark without having to put on a light. So in the trenches, people weren't putting on the light; they could just see the faint glow from their watches at all times. So this was seen as a great luminous watches. The women also like to paint their fingernails because it would glow. They would paint their eyelids to see something fun. And this paint in radium is less than 1/1,000,000th of a gram per watch, but it gives it its magical glow. And to get these dial painters, what they would do for the watches is they would lick the tip of their paintbrush, dip it in the radium, and do it so that you always had a fine point. And it was seen as you were getting this healthy exposure by working there. You had this idea that that radium was going to make you healthier, and you were helping the war effort. But as they're licking the paintbrushes, this radium is going immediately into their bloodstream through their mucous membranes. And by 1921, 4 years after the factory, Maja had to quit her job. She began losing weight. She had terrible joint aches. She developed anemia and bled from her mouth. And within a few months, she was able to lift out. She went to the dentist because her teeth were having problems, and the dentist literally removed her jaw from her from her face with his fingers because it had been deteriorated so bad. On Amelia Maja ends up dying on September 22nd, 1922 at the age of 25. And this is her death really didn't bring any news because of it, because she was an immigrant and people didn't care. But she was only the first. The next year, another dial painter had died, and then another, and another. And by 1925, five were dead, and others, including Amelia's two sisters, were showing terrifying symptoms: anemia, ulcers, tumors, and decaying bones. So in the fall of 1927, New Jersey authorities asked Gettler and Norris to investigate the case of this woman. So they exhume Maja's body, and they encounter their first look at this terrifying new poison. I'd like to add, this is a miserable death. Goodness, her jaw just literally came out. And it doesn't occur quickly. And the radium company says that radium was not the problem. In fact, they didn't take any acknowledgement or responsibility. And they said, look, these people were just poor and they just have bad health. They're just immigrants. It doesn't matter. But many of the victims showed signs long after their jobs, and years or months after. And the local medical examiner in New York, Harris Matland, was convinced that radium was the killer, but no one was backing him up. So when he went to Norris and Gettler for help, they exhume Amelia Maja's body, and they end up doing a series of tests that Gettler designs. And what he ends up doing is covering sheets of x-ray paper so the light couldn't expose them. And then he places them all around her body on the bones and leaves them in a dark box for a couple days. And when he returns, he removes the paper, and he sees that where he had placed the paper, you could see the bones. Like it was almost like its own x-ray that had happened. And that he demonstrates from this that radium was in fact in the bones. Confronted with Gettler's findings, they end up the company ends up having to pay some money to the survivors, but they insist that this is a fraud. It says, and they said, quote, we unfortunately gave work to a great many of people who were physically unfit. Cripples and other incapacitated persons were engaged. What was then considered an act of kindness on our part has now turned against us, end quote. That's what the company said about this. And over the subsequent decades, all those dial painters end up dying from radium in their bones. All of them do. These young women were doomed from the start. Radium, essentially in your body, it masks itself as calcium. So you might have this. They have this wonderful. You have this wonderful system that your body uses to deliver calcium to your bones. Well, radium masks itself as calcium. So instead of getting calcium to your bones, it sends radium to the bones, which literally starts breaking the bones apart. So these women, their spines would crumble, their bones would break if they walked, and from this, there was really no way of saving it. And so it's important to note that in the 1920s, that businesses could run wild. They didn't have safety standards, or if they did have safety standards, it was very limited. Whether it was lead or radium or other poisonings, you didn't have any. There wasn't any agencies to protect these workers. And in the 20s, the enchantment for radium ends. Radioactivity ends. People begin to realize that maybe there is a problem. So radium tonics, patient medicines, health products, there was radium in a lot of makeups, they are removed or outright banned. And so it was really the understanding of these sciences that really urged governments to say, maybe we need to listen to this. This is a problem. So when Prohibition ended in December of 1933, just understand poisoned alcohol almost disappeared as well within the first year of Prohibition. In fact, Norris, after Prohibition, counted only 2 deaths from methanol poisoning. But the Great Depression had triggered violent spikes in death that occur. before the end of, because the Depression happens prior to the end of Prohibition. And just to understand that it was really, in New York, it was pretty bad as well as the world was pretty bad. And we'll talk about that a little bit next week. But what ends up happening to Charles Norris and Gettler is a little different. So, I will talk about what happens to Charles Norris, who had been on the job for 17 years, and also what happens to Alexander Gettler. So by 1935, Norris had been on the job for 17 years as the medical examiner, and he continued to fight increasing uphill battles. And primarily against City Hall, he ends up going through several different mayors, including Jimmy Walker. And then there was a new one, the mayor was LaGuardia. Yes, from where the airport is named. And LaGuardia actually disliked Norris. He felt that besides Norris's anti-prohibition side, which LaGuardia actually approved of, LaGuardia wanted to clean up the streets, and he wanted to clean up the government and whatnot. And he looked at Norris as being someone he needed to get rid of. He accuses him at one point he accuses him of squandering money, that in fact he had ended up embezzling $250,000. There is a raid into his office, and what they end up finding is actually contrary to the fact that Norris actually didn't steal any money. In fact, he was pretty much keeping that organization going, and that he had spent a large chunk of his money doing so. It ends up kind of breaking. It ends up really demoralizing him, and he ends up he takes this long vacation, and upon his return he doesn't look the same. And by September 11th, 1935, Charles Norris dies. His heart gives out. And what is interesting is that the outpouring for his funeral was quite significant. He had a large mass funeral in New York City, and people want to pay their respects to a guy who becomes a legendary figure. I mean, he is the genius that gets detectives, police detectives, to end up working with the medical examiner's office and also with scientists. And for Gettler, he doesn't have a lot of time to mourn. He's continually works, and he becomes numb with work. And Gettler, by 1935 on, he is seen as a guarantee in the courtroom. He is seen as an unanswerable witness. Like, people know exactly what he's, not only that he is trusted, his science is trusted, and that this is a phenomenal pendulum swing from before. When he is hired in 1918, no one believes him. In fact, they go against his science time and time again. But Norris and Gettler developed the forensic science so much that today we believe that that is the absolute way that juries should be used. If juries can rely on science, and that it is considered the most believable testimony. And this was not the case in 1918 and through the 1920s, and it's Gettler and Norris who really revived this. Gettler ends up staying at his post until 1958, into when he's 75. Most New York employees all New York employees were supposed to retire by their 70s, and they make an exception for Gettler because of the quality of his work. He ends up seeing, because of anti-prohibition and also because of the scientific work he does, he actually saw that homicides due to poisoning significantly dropped because it was almost impossible to get away with. You had so much chemical testing and whatnot. So at the time of his retirement, it is believed that he had analyzed over 100,000 bodies. Gettler had a long career with remarkable changes. He ended up seeing the different changes in science and medicine. They actually wanted to do a TV show of him in the 50s, and he refused. And he wanted to stay out of the limelight. Gettler saw that his and Norris's true legacy was was what they had embarked on before. Their mission was to help the public. They wanted a knowledge to get out there to protect the people, and they felt that it was their duty to not only solve murders, but also to prevent government murders, whether accidental or planned. And together they made a partnership between forensic sciences and the government to protect people from unintended consequences from progress. In 1959, the Food and Drug Administration is established, and as a policy, the policy was to look at the chemicals before it goes into the flood of food supplies, cosmetics, and drugs. And this system, yes, it's fallible, but at least it was there to protect the citizens. And this is kind of the legacy of Gettler and Charles Norris. And they end up bringing such profound change and really bring light to some of the most deadly poisons that happened to kill people at the time, whether it's denatured alcohol, methanol, lead, or radium. And they were staunchly against prohibition, so much so that they pointed out that prohibition had failed in the 20s and 30s. Prohibition, they said, look, it did not make the world safer as had intended. There's more violence in society. It did not end public health problems. There were more health problems. It did not. It promised prosperity. It ends in depression. It said it would clean up the cities, but that didn't happen. It said it was clean up politics, but that didn't happen. And so they were part of the team that ends up ending prohibition. And unfortunately, Norris didn't have as long of lifespan to witness a lot of these great changes that happened as a result of their work, but Gettler did to many ways. So this is really an important thing to note, and probably something you may not have known. So I hope you enjoyed learning about forensics and medicine in the 1920s. Thank you.